Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Davis, Executive Vice President and Provost at Baylor, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the first in a series of symposia to celebrate the inaugural year of our President, Kenneth Winston Starr. I'd like to take just a moment to tell you about the impetus behind the profile of speakers that we've chosen. We kept in mind that Baylor is at an historically significant point in its life. We have a new president. The year for which our vision is named, 2012, is drawing near, and we are poised to embark on the planning for our next 10 years. It seemed fitting then that the speakers for these symposia would be nationally renowned scholars whose areas of study could inform our planning and reflection. Speakers who could provide insight in this period of unprecedented changes in higher education, in society, in technology, and in the economy. Speakers who would challenge us to be bold in our dreams for our future. At the same time, we hold dear to our mission that has guided us so well. We certainly have such a speaker with us today, and it is my pleasure to ask Joe McKinney, Professor of Economics and Ben Williams, Professor of International Economics, to introduce him to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I am pleased to introduce to you my longtime friend and former colleague, Kenneth Elzinga, who is Robert C. Taylor Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia. Ken and I have known each other since graduate school days and served together for several years on the University of Virginia faculty. We have been close friends for more than 40 years. A native of Michigan, Ken received his BA degree from Kalamazoo College and MA and PhD degrees in economics from Michigan State University. He is a distinguished scholar in the field of industrial organization, having published prolifically in the field. He has served as economic advisor to the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and is in great demand as an expert witness in high-profile antitrust cases. His work is frequently cited in the academic literature and has also been cited in Supreme Court cases. He has spent time as a visiting scholar at several universities, including the University of Chicago, Cambridge University, and Pepperdine University. At least as important and impressive as Ken's scholarly achievements are his accomplishments as a master teacher. His classes at the University of Virginia are immensely popular. During each fall semester, he teaches 2 500-student sections of Principles of Microeconomics and has co-authored a series of mystery novels where the mysteries are solved through economic reasoning that are used in economic principles courses. During spring semesters, he teaches advanced courses using the Socratic method that have long waiting lists of students eager to sit under his instruction. Ken is extremely devoted to his students, and they in turn hold him in great esteem. He was named the first holder of the Cavaliers Distinguished Teaching Professorship at the University of Virginia and has won teaching awards too numerous to mention. The University of Virginia last year calculated that Ken had taught more than 40,000 students there, more than any other professor in the history of the university. He has been awarded the Thomas Jefferson Award, the highest honor conferred by the University of Virginia. The Southern Economic Association, which he has served as president, has recognized his distinguished teaching with an award in his name given annually to outstanding teachers among its members. Ken is outspoken about his Christian faith and is highly respected for it. He frequently speaks about his faith to fraternities, sororities, and other campus organizations at Virginia, and gives invited lectures to Christian groups and colleges at colleges and universities across the nation. He is a founder and generous supporter of the Center for Christian Study in Charlottesville. The center is located adjacent to the UVA grounds and provides instruction in Christian apologetics and other aspects of the Christian faith to students at the university and to the community. Ken is also an active member of Trinity Presbyterian Church. He serves on the National Board of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and on the Board of Trustees of Hope College, a well-known Christian college in Michigan. It is from the perspective of his involvement in higher education at both a prestigious state university and at distinctively Christian institutions of higher education that he speaks today on the subject of Christian higher education versus Christians in higher education. Please join me in welcoming Ken Elzinga as the first speaker in the Presidential Symposium series.
Thank you very much, Joe, for that generous and kind introduction. It's a custom for speakers in the United States to say, "I'm glad to be here." Usually that statement is a total fabrication. The speaker would rather be at the beach or at a concert or at home reading a book. But in my case, I am happy to be here. It's an honor for me to speak at Baylor University in conjunction with Ken Starr, assuming the presidency of this institution. Economists are not always known for the accuracy of their forecasts, but I predict that Baylor University will flourish under President Starr's leadership. And as an aside, I have long had an affection for Baylor University, in no small part because one of its faculty, Professor Joe McKinney, who just introduced me, profoundly influenced and shaped my own personal and professional life. And it's a privilege for me to speak about a topic that goes right to the heart of this institution's future as a university with a Christian identity. I want to distinguish Christian higher education from Christians in higher education. And let me begin, if I may, on an autobiographical note. I joined the faculty of the University of Virginia in the fall of 1967 as a freshly minted PhD, and I'll let you do the arithmetic if you want to estimate how old that makes me. For all of my career, except for 2 semesters, I've been a faculty member at secular schools. The University of Virginia is often called Mr. Jefferson's University because Thomas Jefferson designed and conceived the school. The institution is relentlessly secular, as Mr. Jefferson would have wanted. Thomas Jefferson, after all, is the founding father most identified with the constitutional doctrine of a separation between church and state. So what does it mean for a school to be relentlessly secular? Try these on for size. When I arrived at UVA in 1967, Christian student groups were not permitted to meet on the grounds of the university. So far as I know, Virginia was the only public university to have this restraint. And how God used 2 UVA students to break down this barrier is a story worth telling, but not here. As an assistant professor, I once tried to schedule a room in the student union for a faculty Bible study and was told no. I asked if I could schedule a room to discuss the writings of Karl Marx. No problem. To read Mein Kampf. Not an eyebrow was raised. But the Gospel of Mark, that was apparently off limits to discuss on grounds. Now, I'm happy to report that these situations have changed, but if Mr. Jefferson were to return to the grounds of his university today, he would not find any establishment, to use his word, much less promotion of religious faith. Now, let me tell you one autobiographical fact that's relevant to this talk. When parents asked me to speak to their high school-age children about attending the University of Virginia, if in the course of this conversation I learn that the children are followers of Jesus, I always ask them if they're considering a Christian school as well. And if not, I ask why. And we have a conversation about the costs and the benefits, remember I'm an economist, of Christian versus secular schools. So I am a friend of Christian higher education, even though my calling as a matter of vocation has been to a secular school. And that's the personal background I bring to the question, what's the difference between Christians in higher education and Christian higher education? Let me begin with taxonomy. At secular schools, Christians in higher education can be placed in two different bins or categories. I'm not happy with the terms, but I'll call one group the privatizers and the other the evangelicals. Privatizers in higher education are dualists. Another term for them might be two-spheres Christians. Privatizers or two-spheres Christians view their faith as disconnected from their work as professors. They may be involved in a local church, often heavily involved, but these professors, the privatizers, are not identified at their schools as Christians. This aspect of their identity may never be known by students or colleagues. Not that their faith is a deep, dark secret. They simply consider this data point about themselves as irrelevant to their life in the academy. They're identified as professors of chemistry or accounting or German literature. Their Christian faith is private and apart from their jobs. These professors live in two worlds, not simultaneously but sequentially. One is secular, their campus. The other is sacred, their church. Now, let me say as an aside, from my observation, some Christian faculty at Christian colleges and universities live like privatizers as well. The second kind of Christian professor in secular higher education I'll call the evangelical. Now, the term evangelical is a portmanteau expression, and it requires some unpacking. And I do not mean it simply as a label. By evangelical, I mean to include all those Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant who subscribe warmly to the biblical and theological tenets of the Christian church, those cardinal beliefs and affirmations which have been reiterated in the confessions and creedal affirmations of Christian churches. The professors, researchers, and scholars in higher education I have labeled the evangelicals believe that the quest for truth begins and ends with Jesus. Their work involves teaching and research in their disciplines, but their calling entails extending the reign of Jesus into all realms. The evangelicals might resonate with the words of the Dutch reformer Abraham Kuyper, and here I'm quoting, "There is not one square inch of the entire creation about which Jesus Christ does not cry out, 'This is mine, this belongs to me,'" close quote. They are professors who, in accord with 1 Peter 3:15, are always ready to give a defense of the hope that is within them. But they do so, as the Apostle Peter also makes clear, with gentleness and reverence. So you will not find these professors praying before class. You will not find them proclaiming the gospel in the classroom. You will not find them teaching their courses from a Christian perspective. While they are Christians in higher education, their institutional environment is not one of Christian higher education. Their lectures will not begin with a prayer. They will not end with an altar call. Indeed, evangelicals at secular schools must be scrupulously fair and impartial with their students who are not followers of Jesus, treating the academic endeavors of these students the same way they would students who share their Christian convictions. So evangelical professors may be quite visible as Christians at their secular colleges and universities, but they operate under a constraint. And that constraint is that fundamentally they've been hired by their institutions to teach and do research in a particular discipline or subject matter, not to evangelize or engage in gospel proclamation. To the extent they're open about their Christian faith, the evangelicals do so in the same way that professors who are enthused about activities like sailing or cooking often share with students something about their extracurricular passions and interests. So a professor who's passionate about sailing can make that known to her students, and her students may in turn find that interesting. Her students may even become interested in sailing. But all of her students understand that an interest or disinterest in sailing has nothing to do with the treatment the student receives in the classroom or laboratory. Students of an evangelical professor in higher education understand that their grade is not a function of their own religious beliefs or lack thereof. Robert Benchley once observed that there are two kinds of people in the world: those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. And so for the purposes of this talk, I'm in the first group. And in my reductionist bimodal distribution, one Christian professor sees his faith as largely irrelevant to his job. The other sees her job as a calling under the lordship of Jesus. And no doubt there are Christian faculty who manage to straddle the bimodal distribution, but my reductionism is useful for where I'm going next. Because next I want to turn to Christian higher education. What should it look like? To contextualize the question, what should Baylor University be like compared to an institution like the University of Virginia? How should the two schools differ? What's the difference between my being a Christian in higher education and a school like Baylor University actually doing or producing or being Christian higher education? Here's my understanding of Christian higher education. Christian higher education does not start with Christian students. Now that surprises some of my colleagues at the University of Virginia. And some Christian colleges and universities have a Christian litmus test for the enrolling of students. I think that's a distraction. If prospective students who are academically qualified want to be part of Christian higher education, they should be welcome. If the Christian faith is defensible, if the Christian faith is compelling, if the Christian faith is true, non-Christian students should be welcome to live and learn in the environment of Christian higher education and test the faith. Just as Jesus did not throw out doubting Thomas, Christian higher education should be an environment that welcomes doubting Thomases as students. But Christian higher education, to merit that designation and imprimatur, should be dominated by a faculty who are followers of Jesus. By that I mean the majority of faculty at an institution of Christian higher education should be Christians. The designation or description makes no sense if that's not the case. It is not my job, it might be President Starr's, to determine precisely what constitutes a majority. And it is not my job, it might be President Starr's, to determine the taxonomy of the term Christian. But I'm going to suggest a minimal hurdle or benchmark that I first heard from David Bast. Faculty members who can agree to the Nicene Creed without crossing their fingers behind their back. Now I realize this benchmark may not square with the Baptist motto, no creed but the Bible. And my point here is not to spotlight the Nicene Creed, but rather to make a point about the relevance and importance of some defining taxonomy. Regarding Christian higher education, our Reno recently wrote, not every professor and graduate student must be a Christian. Not all scholarship has to crackle with the ardor of faith. Committed Jewish or Muslim or Hindu scholars can contribute to a spirit of faithful inquiry at a Christian school. In fact, their witness in our contemporary academic culture of antinomianism and unbelief can be far more powerful than the example of a Christian scholar who bows to the latest academic fashions. My point is that students are transients. They come and go. Christian higher education is defined by a core of faculty who believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, that every thought is to be made captive to him, and they, the faculty, are not ashamed of the gospel. My undergraduate school, I was going to leave the name silent, but Joe McKinney mentioned it, was begun by Baptists many years ago. And I have no doubt that the founders of this college were committed Christians who had a vision for a school that would embody Christian higher education. And over the years, the influence of Christianity waned at this school, as it has at so many colleges and universities in the United States. When I was an undergraduate, I remember the college president at my alma mater stating that the school had hired its first avowed atheist on the faculty. And this was announced with a measure of pride, as if the institution had come of age. I look back upon that now as the time when Ichabod, the spirit has departed, might have been written across the campus gates. Now, for those who would object that requiring a faculty that is predominantly Christian will suppress otherwise unfettered academic freedom of inquiry and the pursuit of truth, I would respond in two ways. The first is the chronicle of how secular institutions have suppressed unfettered academic freedom as well. And the second is with a rhetorical question: if Christian higher education is not made so by Christian educators, what is the alternative paradigm that merits the label? So Christian higher education starts with Christian faculty. Christian higher education also will have rules and precepts for living in Christian community, but the rules, hear me on this, are derivative of Christian higher education. They're not the foundation. Years ago, T.S. Eliot put the matter this way: the purpose of Christian higher education would not be merely to make men and women pious Christians. A Christian education must primarily teach people to be able to think in Christian categories. On this point, I have a different view than many parents as to why their children should be at schools like Baylor University. I know parents, I talk to them all the time, who want their children to go to a school with Christian roots and a continuing Christian identity because they think their children are less likely to get involved in drugs, less likely to get AIDS, less likely to fall in love with a non-Christian, less likely to, and it's a long list, and the list goes right down to less likely to end up wearing a ring in their nose or having a tattoo on their neck. Now, I don't make light of these parental concerns. It sounds like I have, but I really don't. But my concept of Christian higher education travels in a very different direction than the rules of student conduct. I happen not to think that Christian education should be safe. I think Christian higher education should have an edge to it, just as it was dangerous to hang around with Jesus, and even riskier to follow him. Christian higher education should be defined by differences in teaching, differences in credentialing, and differences in mentoring, and the faculty is pivotal in each of these. And let me say, as an aside, if I had time for another talk, I would discuss how Christian higher education might cause differences in curriculum, tuition, and even the campus bookstore. And I mention all these because the difference between Christians in higher education and Christian higher education is not minor or cosmetic. Christian higher education should be radically different. Now let me allocate 5 minutes on teaching, 5 minutes on credentialing, 5 minutes on mentoring, and then I'll conclude. Teaching. It probably goes without saying that when a physicist at Baylor University teaches Bernoulli's theorem, it's not taught differently than it would be at UVA. When I teach the economic principle of demand elasticity at UVA, I'm confident that the very identical formula is taught by Professor McKinney and his colleagues here at Baylor. Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage shows the benefits of free trade when taught in Charlottesville as in Waco. But when I teach the economic theory of income distribution at the University of Virginia, which I will start next week in the classroom, it is not fair game for me to ask, what might the biblical principle of gleaning, leaving some extra grain in the fields for the poor, what does that teach about income distribution in an industrialized society? You can have that kind of conversation in Christian higher education. It should not be considered out of bounds to think of biblical perspectives of this sort, even if Christians in higher education who are at secular schools cannot go there. This is called integration, integrating the Christian faith with one's discipline. It's not easy to do, and it will involve different shapes and forms and different disciplines to take the Bible's great themes of creation and fall and redemption and weave them into classroom discourse. To my mind, this is a primary distinctive between Christian higher education and Christians in higher education. The classrooms and laboratories and seminar rooms of Christian higher education are places where faculty and students are free to explore topics that may be off limits to Christian faculty at secular universities. Or, more likely to be the case, such themes are simply irrelevant to the academic discourse. If the faculty members in Christian higher education simply believe that their job is to teach what they learned in graduate school and go home and be good church members, then integration won't take place. And the school will produce a generation of students, many of whom will come to believe there's a gap, if not a chasm, between the secular and the sacred. Joel Carpenter has written that every Christian school needs some faculty who focus on questions of faith and knowledge and a Christian worldview. But Carpenter goes on to add that in Christian higher education, every professor must in some sense be a lay theologian. Professor Perry Glanzer here on the Baylor faculty. His article on redemptive moral development in higher education is the best paper I know on the subject. I find it difficult to improve upon his proposal. Let me read it. I believe Christian colleges such as my own should rename their religion departments as theology departments in order to highlight the fact that we seek to help students become worshiping theologians, versed in the narratives, affections, and practices of the church, and not merely critical thinkers about religion. General education courses pertaining to Bible or theology could also use this reorienting. Beyond theology, a Christian liberal education should both deepen our understanding of Christian practices and help us think critically about them. Now let me turn to credentialing. And what I'm trying to say here is awkward for me to explain. And let me start this way. The business world emphasizes credentials, the professions of law and medicine emphasize credentials, but higher education really emphasizes credentials. We put them before our names, after our names. We calibrate and quantify performance. We rank people all the time. We look up to and we look down on people according to performance-based credentials or titles. For years, I wrote a personal letter of congratulations to every student of mine who got an A+. I was proud of them, and they made me look good too. I still do this, but now I write a letter to every student who fails my classes. Last fall, I wrote 30 of these letters. I suspect Jesus would have thought first to write the F students. Christian higher education would, I hope, recognize before I did that the A+ students already get lots of strokes. It took me about 20 years into my career to catch on to writing the young men and women who failed my class and whom perhaps I had failed as their teacher. De-emphasizing credentials is a mark of Christian higher education, and I'm much taken by the Apostle Paul's example here. How does Paul generally state his credentials? Right at the front of his epistles. Read the first verse of Romans. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus. Philippians 1:1. Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus. Titus 1:1. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. In most of higher education, a servant is not much of a credential. It should be in Christian higher education. I consider credentialing one of the most important areas of distinction between Christian higher education and secular schools. And let me be as clear here as I know how. As a fan of Baylor University, I'm pleased to learn when her students get into Ivy League schools to do graduate work. But because what Baylor University is about is Christian higher education, I'm also pleased to learn when Baylor students who were estranged from their families have been reconciled as a consequence of being in this academic community. And that some Baylor students who came to Waco shackled by materialism are free of these bonds when they leave. And that some Baylor students who were chronically dishonest upon their arrival now let their nay be nay and their yea be nay, yea. And that some Baylor students who were once snobs are now marked by humility because of being a part of this academic community. And that some Baylor students who once believed that the world is really nothing more than a random collocation of atoms in a purposeless universe now realize that they're made in God's image and that the whole world is full of God's glory. Baylor University can place an advertisement in the Chronicle of Higher Education heralding the number of its students who go to do graduate work in the Ivy League. That's easy to do. But somehow Baylor also needs to recognize and acknowledge to its constituents that the very best students here are the sanctified ones, the broken ones whom God can use. Precisely how Christian higher education can encourage and commend sanctification without it somehow devolving into a line item on a student's resume will be an unending challenge. Professors play a role here. Students in Christian higher education need to know that the faculty value the character and moral compass of their students, that professors admire godliness, that the faculty's deepest satisfaction as professors come from seeing students become what God wants them to be, people for whom Jesus is preeminent. Now let me talk about mentoring, or if you prefer the term, discipling. I would expect Christian higher education to be characterized by professors who mentor students. Not just teach them chemistry and accounting, not just teach them biology and Spanish, but model out for them how to walk with Jesus. Not because these faculty members have mastered how to do this, but simply because they've been pilgrims longer, because they have more experience with the consequences of sin and redemption. I'll be very candid here. I have been surprised in my travels at how few faculty members in Christian higher education mentor or disciple students. And when I've asked why, the answer I sometimes hear is, well, that's for the dean of the chapel to do, or that's the job of the dean of students' office. Now, I'm an economist. I understand that answer. It is right out of Adam Smith. It appeals to what Adam Smith called specialization and division of labor. But while I understand the answer, I can restrain my enthusiasm for it, because to me it means that Christian higher education has professors who are not investing in the lives of their students beyond teaching them chemistry and accounting and biology and Spanish. You can learn chemistry and accounting, biology, and Spanish anywhere, and often at less cost than in Christian higher education. Many institutions of higher education in the United States who do a pretty good job at inserting faculty into classroom and laboratory settings for teaching purposes struggle to use the very same faculty to advise students outside the classroom and laboratory. The Chronicle of Higher Education recently ran an article by Mark Montgomery, teaches at Grinnell College, entitled Confessions of a Bad Academic Advisor. And most faculty members I know can relate to that article. It can be difficult and awkward, whether the professor is at a secular school or Christian school, to advise a first-year student as to exactly which level of calculus or Spanish class is optimal, much less advise the student whether they ought to pursue a career in teaching or healthcare rather than commerce or state government. But Christian higher education exists because there once was a Galilean who made disciples, and his disciples called him rabbi or teacher. And therein lies a principle by which teachers today are to invite, not coerce, but invite students to be their disciples. That is, to mentor them. Jesus taught his followers the law and the prophets, but he also lived among them, and he even washed their feet. I have wondered over and over again what the Lord's illustration of foot washing means to the professoriate of the 21st century. I once tried to refill the water glass of an international student who was a dinner guest in my home. No, he said, you're the professor. I cannot let you serve me. In my country, it's the other way around. And my initial thought was, that sounds like a nice place to be a professor. But as a Christian professor, I am asked to think what it means to be a foot washer. Many of my students would not want their feet washed, and many do not want to be discipled. But in Christian higher education, there should be students who learn more than the material in the textbook and the lecture because they're at an institution that values, that is, it devotes resources to the making and forming of disciples. Now, I look at my notes and I see that I'm nearing the end of my talk. I see a number of undergraduates here. When I was in college, my speech teacher told me that I should always inform my audience when I was nearing the end of a talk. She said it would revive hope among my audience. So I'm at the point of hope revival. At the risk of sounding obsequious, let me mention that Baylor gets a lot of things right in modeling Christian higher education. Christian professors at secular schools, I would be in this category, would look with envy, sanctified envy, I would hope, at Baylor's sponsorship of conferences like the King James Bible and the World It Made, that assemble scholars like Philip Jenkins and Alistair McGrath and Mark Knoll and Laman Sani and N.T. Wright under one roof. I would be thrilled if something like that happened at my university, but I don't hold my breath. Or Baylor's Symposium on Sacred Texts, Holy Image, with exhibitions of Chagall, Raoul, and Fujimara. Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion is internationally known. And in my own field of economics, some of the premier conferences that link the dismal science with the Christian faith have been on this campus. In short, there is a great foundation already established at this institution. And if I may take a certain liberty with the words of the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Thessalonians, he commended Christians in Thessalonica for their sanctification, but then he wrote, "We urge and exhort you in the Lord Jesus that you should abound more and more." And soon thereafter, after commending them for their brotherly love, Paul writes, "We urge you, brethren, that you increase more and more." So to put Paul's words in an academic context, as Baylor University seeks to fulfill its mission of offering Christian higher education, in the midst of its current track record, may the school's trajectory be one of more and more. When Jesus claims to be the way, the truth, and the life, he honors truth. Christian higher education honors the pursuit of truth in the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, the applied sciences, the professions, and in the arts. The pursuit of Christian higher education elevates students and professors as well by giving them the lofty status of being in God's image. Secular universities can tell their students nothing more than that they're talented, they're the best and the brightest. President Starr has explained his understanding of the pursuit of truth with the expression, discovery of new knowledge. Mr. Jefferson, the founder of the university, would agree with that. But President Starr does not stop there. In the most recent issue of First Things, he wrote, "One of Baylor's core convictions is to, quote, facilitate the discovery of new knowledge to the glory of God and the betterment of humanity. Baylor is a place where at our best we develop the manifold gifts of body, mind, and spirit, and by so doing seek to glorify the Creator, whose handiwork we are and whose creation we study and celebrate." Mr. Jefferson could not have put it that way. My own theological convictions have been influenced heavily by the Protestant Reformation, and consequently I've been struck at how my aspirations for Baylor University under President Starr's leadership line up with what Reverend John Jenkins said in his inaugural address as the new president of Notre Dame. These are Jenkins' words. Now listen to them carefully. "Notre Dame is different. Combining religious faith and academic excellence is not widely emulated or even admired among the opinion makers in higher education. Yet in this age, especially, we at Notre Dame must have the courage to be who we are. If we are afraid to be different from the world, how can we make a difference in the world?" Now let me swap just a couple words and geographically transfer what President Jenkins said from Indiana to Texas, from Hoosier country to the Lone Star State. Baylor University is different. Combining religious faith and academics is not widely emulated or even admired among the opinion makers in higher education. Yet in this age, especially, we at Baylor University must have the courage to be who we are. If we're afraid to be different from the world, how can we make a difference in the world? The opening line of C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is, "There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. Now, isn't that a wonderful opening line? There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. That opening line with the name Eustace Clarence Scrubb doesn't match Melville's opening line, "Call me Ishmael," in Moby Dick, but it comes close. And of this boy, Lewis wrote, "Although Eustace didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about grades." Secular schools have a difficult time explaining why students should care about a subject for its own sake, apart from grades. Christian higher education can explain that. Thank God, quite literally, for that. From an economist's perspective, Christian higher education also expands the choice set of higher education. Baylor University makes for a more diverse population of educational inputs and outputs. I think even students at schools of Christian higher education who are not themselves followers of Jesus ought to support the Christian distinctives of their schools, if only because of the valuable diversity schools like Baylor bring to higher education. And this diversity reminds me of Benjamin Franklin's remark at the close of the Constitutional Convention, 1787. Franklin said, "We've given you a republic if you can keep it." 165 years ago, if I did my arithmetic correctly, the founders of Baylor University, in effect, said, "We've given you an institution of Christian higher education, if you can keep it." 165 years later, Baylor University's homepage describes the school as a Christian community of faith. President Starr and the faculty, you have been given an institution of Christian higher education. May you continue to keep it until the Lord Jesus returns. Thank you for your hospitality.
I want to confess that the lineup of speakers was set in a way based on who could get here when. But I think there might have been some divine intervention that got Dr. Elzinga here first. This is critical for us to hear as we embark on our planning for our next 10-year vision. We cannot lose sight of who we are, who we've been for 165 years. So thank you so much for starting us off with this great speech.
My pleasure.
I'd like to open the floor for questions, and so I'll ask Dr. Elzinga to come, and there'll be microphones floating around the room. If you'll just identify yourself, and we'll send a microphone in your direction.
President Starr, you will not offend me if you leave. I know you have 1,000 high school aspirants to talk to, so.
Teresa. It will come to you, John.
Dr. Elzinga, it's great to have you here, and thank you so much for your message. My question concerns with Christians in a secular university. I'm wondering if there's kind of a schizophrenia or a difficulty for Christians in a secular university who are in the social sciences compared to the natural sciences, because as Christians, our Christian categories relate to the nature of the human person. So when you're in the social sciences, your discipline, even our discipline of economics, has a particular view of the human person, I think. And does this create a difficulty when that is not a Christian view of a human person? If indeed it is not, I don't know.
Thanks for your question. There certainly is a tension that I feel as a teacher in the social sciences at a secular university. I understand completely that the Commonwealth of Virginia, UVA is a public school as well as a secular school, that I have been invited to be on the faculty to teach economics. And my students must learn the discipline as it is conventionally understood. They need the tools of the economist, if only to go from my principles course into the intermediate courses. And if I were so fundamentally at odds with the task of teaching that discipline, it would be incumbent upon me to leave the university and go to that institution and go someplace where I felt I could teach what I really wanted to teach. I'm comfortable with economics as a social science in some ways, but I don't consider it inscripturated, infallible, inerrant, and I don't teach it in that way. And a public university gives me enough leeway around the edges to do things where I can insert thoughts about thinking of the economic model, the economic paradigm, in a different way. I mentioned in my talk the only time I have been at a Christian institution was the time I spent at Pepperdine University, and there I taught a course on Christianity and economics. And the course was one half, what do the Christian scriptures teach about economic conduct? And the other one was, what does economic theory teach about the phenomenon of religion, particularly Christianity? And when I was teaching this course, I first thought I could only do this at a Christian school. And as I taught it, I realized I could take this course back to the University of Virginia and I would teach it almost the same way. I probably wouldn't begin the class in prayer. Well, to eliminate the probably I would not begin the class in prayer. But I would teach much the same content. And I would welcome Christians and non-Christians into the classroom. And I've been asked by many, many students to teach that class. I've not done so, but I realized that the type of curriculum I developed could transfer. But in terms of my principles class, it is taught very much like in the conventional wisdom, the conventional paradigm. But the students know, or at least I believe they know, that I'm a follower of Jesus, and that in some sense I march to a different drummer. That economics is not my God. Teaching economics is not the center of who I am. Who I am is centered on the person of Jesus. My students come to know that. As I said, if I were to teach at Baylor, I would have a certain freedom that I do not have at UVA, and I gave an example of it in the teaching of income distribution, where I would be able to go into the view of scriptures and would be able to do so with the idea that this is not only of interest, but it's of importance and even authoritative.
Hi. Oh, that's loud. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm just starting off as a teacher, so I really loved and appreciated when you told us about how you write a note to every student that fails your class. I just think that's a beautiful idea, and it's something that I want to start doing as a teacher. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little more about that. What do you write, and how do you give the note to the student?
Yeah, the A+ letter, everybody hear the question? I guess you can with the mic. Thank you. The A+ letter was easy to write, and that I wrote many years ago. The F letter is one that I spent a lot of time on because I wanted to try and get it right. I wanted it to be a pastoral letter, and it has been. The impact, the consequences of that letter have been far beyond the consequences and impact of the A+ letter. In fact, frankly, a lot of students who get the A+ letter, it's just, oh yeah, they have such a sense of their own intellectual talents that this is something that should follow as a matter of course. It's just one more thing that they're supposed to receive because of their intellectual prowess. But the F letter is sent to somebody who is truly broken in some sense and is in need of pastoring. What I basically do is try to get across two ideas. One is that there could be very good reasons that I would understand why they failed my class. They could have been going through personal experiences with parents who were ill, parents who were getting a divorce, tragedies in their own life that distracted them from their studies, and that they should take heart that if that's the reason, this has nothing to do with their intellectual prowess. That's kind of thought number one. Thought number two is that if they failed my class simply because they didn't work hard, that there may be a lesson here about, is this a good place for them to be? Is this a good use of their time to be at the University of Virginia? And the third point is that I may have failed them. There may have been times that I wasn't available to them. This is a class of over 1,000 students. The people learn in different ways, and maybe learning in the context of 1,000 students just was not the way they learn. Some people don't learn well out of textbooks. This is a textbook and lecture class. They might have done well in economics and if it were a seminar taught with papers instead of a text. So I make that point. And the fourth point I make is that their identity and this is where it gets very pastoral and is distinctly Christian. I mean, I'm free to write a letter who I am as a believer, is that their identity is not tied up with an F in Econ 201. Their identity is somewhere else. And from my perspective, because they're made in God's image, they're fundamentally somebody different to me than somebody who got an F in Econ 201. And I welcome them to come back and see me if they want to talk to me. That some students have such a sense of shame, particularly some of the international students, that if they fail a class, they feel they could not go back to the professor's office. And I want them to know that's not true. It's actually quite the opposite. They're in some sense, I want them to know they're more welcome to come back to my office than the A+ student who really doesn't need to see me again.
You say that the purpose of Christian education should be the pursuit of truth. I would assume that being Christian higher education, it would also begin to one extent or another with a definition of truth that is, particular to some extent. You mentioned the Nicene Creed, to some extent to the concept of being Christian. Will those at some point become enemies to each other? Is there a point at which the one truth will trump the other? And is there a benefit to a secular institution that there isn't in a Christian institution as far as allowing that truth, quote, to be pursued?
Sure. We live in a pluralistic society, and I'm grateful for that. I'm nervous about theocratic societies, even if the theology is Christian. So in that sense, I'm suppose westernized, or I'm a product of the Enlightenment. But I take the circumstances as they are. We live in a pluralistic society, and in that society, I'm grateful that there are secular schools, because most people in the pursuit of education want a secular education. I think it would be unfortunate if the doors of secular education were closed off to believers who are willing to operate in the way that I described in my talk as Christians in higher education. I think that would be unfortunate, and where I hear that that occurs, I find that very troubling to me. But I also think there's great value in a pluralistic society of having schools that are distinctly Christian, who are not ashamed of that. I go back to the verse, I forget the exact verse, but in Romans 1, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's very healthy in American higher education to have some schools that are not ashamed of the gospel, who are not ashamed of having a distinctive Christian identity. And as I say, I think that starts with faculty who, with all the differences of what it means to be a Christian, that they still would be a group of people gathered with the idea that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, that he honors truth. The Christian faith is not afraid of truth. The pursuit of truth by faculty is a God-honoring endeavor in a variety of disciplines. And yet there would be in this institution a mentoring, a discipling of students by faculty that would admire students and encourage students not only for their ability to do technical economics, but for the moral compass they have when they leave. Now, to say that sounds radical today, but if you go back to the early times of the Yales and Princetons in this country, that would have just been understood as, well, of course. But it's different today because we live in a largely secular society, and so these words seem radical. And for Baylor to be what I've indicated I would like it to be, will itself be seen as radical. But radical, it's also, to my mind, refreshing. And it should be exciting to be a part of something that is refreshing and different and brings valuable and, I believe, inscripturated insight into the world of the academy.
President Starr, absolutely.
Thanks, Teresa. There's been a good deal of introspection within the secular education community, introspection about its ends. The distinguished Dean Emeritus of Harvard College wrote a book, Excellence Without Soul. I could go on with other examples. What's your take on what is happening, at least as an undercurrent, in secular higher education, as to whether the permanent things, the permanent questions are being examined?
Yeah. Thank you, President Starr. There is this undercurrent. I see it at my own university, but it is very much an undercurrent at this point. It's not bubbled up in some way that's really evident or shaking the foundations of the school. But when presidents and deans of secular schools now recognize their students, when they invite them in for the opening talk, and I've heard dozens of these at my university, it is flatter than it used to be to tell them, you're the best class we've ever had, you're the best and the brightest, you can accomplish this, you can do this, with never a recognition that these are broken kids. You know, they come with lots of hurt and pain and sin, but that can never be acknowledged at a secular school. It's starting now to people where there's a recognition among administrators who are not believers that we can't continue this public relations statement that these are the best and the brightest. They are in academic sense. They're by various metrics. They're the best class we've ever had and so on. But they're deeply needy people for a moral compass. And where does that come from? Where does it come from in a secular institution where people shrink from any sort of moral judgment except making moral judgments against those people who make moral judgments? I mean, that's the great irony of secular education, is the elevation of tolerance to the point where one cannot acknowledge one's need, if not of a savior, a need of a moral compass, of a foundation, what Eliot would have called a center.
I've got a question, but before I get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about, I'm one of the people that have had him for a class, Dr. Elzinga, so good to see you.
And he got an A+ letter, too. So.
I don't know about that. I didn't get the F letter, though. Anyone else in here had him for a class? Because it sounds like a lot of people have had. And I was a biology major, and I took his class solely for him because 20 years ago this fall I became a Christian, and he was one of the very few faculty, I would say between 5 and 10, that we knew were Christians, that if we took his class, we could learn from him and grow from him. So I'm so excited to have him here today. It's been really excited, and you certainly haven't disappointed me with what you shared. One other brief story on him. I went to him and never met him before and was just asking him questions about working in higher ed as a Christian, what it would be like, and he certainly prepared me and asked me to think about Christian higher ed, which led me to work in Christian higher ed for 4 years before the last 12 years I've been in secular higher ed. And I was telling him about a missions trip, and should I go to that? And he said, and then what do I do with a summer job? And I don't remember it all, and you probably don't either, but he said something like, I'll pay for your missions trip because it's going to change your life, and then I'll pay you to work for me this summer, and we can meet weekly and just talk and get to know each other, and you can do this research for me on Xerox copier machines or something like that. Do you remember that at all? I
do. I remember it very well.
So I was like, I'll research anything if I get to spend time with this man. And so he's one of my mentors in life. But I guess my question for you is, you lived among the students on the lawn, and you were one of the people that really was approachable. Even to non-Christian students, they loved you, even though they may not have known about your faith. What is it? How did you do that? How did Jesus change in a way that made students want to spend time, and you bring them into your house? Like even today, as an administrator myself, 20 years later, I'm like, how do I create an atmosphere with students that is so welcoming?
Ken, would you mind describing what it means to live on the lawn?
Sure. Yeah. The expression "living on the lawn." If I mentioned that Thomas Jefferson was the founder of the University of Virginia. And he was in many, many ways, including recruiting the first faculty, but also as an architect designing the physical facilities in which the university would operate. And the grounds of the university are the part designed by Thomas Jefferson, and they are not only beautiful from an architectural aesthetic standpoint, but they also represent his philosophy of education is embedded in the grounds. And Mr. Jefferson despised the European university model. He really did. That's not too strong a word. And part of what he despised about it was the hierarchy of the professor being unapproachable, the professor dining at high table, the professor having all the titles in front of his name, Herr Doktor Professor, before you could get to the person's last name. And so when Thomas Jefferson founded the university, one of the things he wanted, which I admire very much, is to do away with the titles. And it was an all-male institution. When it was founded, everybody was to be called Mr. So to this day, many students call me Mr. Elzinga, not Professor Elzinga or Dr. Elzinga. And the students would then have been called Mr. as well. This was part of his leveling idea. Another part of his leveling idea was to have the faculty live among the students. And so when he designed the lawn, there are what is called pavilions, 10 gorgeous knockout homes where the faculty would live, and then the students lived in rooms connecting these pavilions, with the rotunda being the library at the center of the institution. And just one other thing on the architecture that's of interest, all universities up until that time had a quadrangle. And you see that if you go to Oxford or Cambridge. And that represented, in Jefferson's mind, a closed view of truth. And so Thomas Jefferson cut off the end of the quadrangle, and it was like a U, and it was to be open to the world and new ideas. I had the privilege of living for 10 years in one of those pavilions. It was one of the great honors of my life and one of the great opportunities to live in this beautiful home. And we were able to have many, many students into our home at very low transaction costs, because all they had to do was walk over. They didn't have to get in a car, they didn't have to get in a bus. We didn't have to pick them up. We still have a lot of students in our home, but it was so easy in those days. And where I got this idea of the sort of hospitality and openness to students, and you know, so much of what we do, it's because somebody else modeled it out for us. You can read all you want in a book, you can listen to me talk about this, but if you haven't seen somebody model it out, you're probably not going to do it. I had a model one time when I went to Oxford. It was a man named Jim Houston. Some of you know that name. Jim was a faculty member at Oxford who took a radical move in terms of his Christian faith and went to Canada and started Regent College, part of the University of British Columbia. People thought he was mad when he did that, but he had this beautiful home in Oxford, and I was at his home one time, and I was struck at the number of students who were in his home. Including a Rhodes Scholar who was at Oxford. It was the first Rhodes Scholar I'd ever met, and this boy was terribly homesick, and I never forgot you could be a Rhodes Scholar and still be homesick. But Jim had all these people in his home, and I was just a young pup on the Virginia faculty then, and still trying to figure out what my life would be like as a professor. And I asked Jim and Rita, I said, you know, tell me why? Why is this? Why are all these students here? And Jim said, my wife and I never look upon this home as really our own. Now, I know Jim had a title on it. He had the property rights in the home. But he said, we look upon it as something God gave us to share. And I took that message back to the USA. And I thought, if I ever have a home, I didn't then, but if I ever had a home, I wanted it to be a place where I would think that God had the title to this. And in some supernatural way, I was to share it. I was to be a good steward over it. And that led to our inviting students in, and we've done that for years and have had literally hundreds and hundreds of students come through our home. I will say that with all the, and one of the things that models out to students, you know, in American culture, even Christians who are very open about their faith, when it comes to their home, it's this American notion that you know, that's a man's castle, and you know, there's a moat around it, and the bridge is up when he gets home, and it doesn't have to be that way. You can have an openness with students coming in your home, and they see you in a different light when they're not in your office, and sometimes they're more relaxed and they're more able to learn what you're like, and you can share not only economics but who you are in Christ. And to my mind, that's part of this mentoring or discipling thing is the use of your home. We have most faculty, we may complain about our salaries, but relatively speaking, we're well paid and well cared for, and we usually have nice homes. And they don't have to be just for our own family. And they can. Now, some people may not be in that circumstance. They may not be their calling. But from my observation, a lot of people have never tried it to see if it might be their calling. And I never would have if it hadn't been for Jim Houston's influence. It just wouldn't have occurred to me naturally.
I think John, Dean Engelhardt had a question in that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the different sorts of statements. I think something that, despite being a Christian higher education institution, I think we, as faculty, continue to struggle with the actual implementation of what that means, and each of us in different ways. But because of where I come from, I want to come back to the issue of pedagogical steps. And I'm going to say pedagogical and demeanor steps of what it means to be a professor in a Christian higher education institution. You gave some examples of content by your reference to taking a biblical perspective on the content and taking that example in economics and working from that. You gave an example of a kind of demeanor for what it means to be a Christian with the F letter, and it portrayed those values that come out in the content of what you were writing in the letter. Then you also talked about mentoring and as kind of an almost co-curricular or extracurricular piece, not per se part of the course. But I'm wondering what kinds of strategies in terms of working with students in that interaction in class, or the way you think about students in that class, would fit this notion of being a Christian during the act of teaching. To give you an example, a couple of things that crossed my mind were valuing the person as a person, not just as a learner, but as a person, as another human being, and this notion of taking the content of the course and applying it to problems in society, where that's kind of serving others through the knowledge that you've gained. And those are two things that sort of quickly occur to me, but I'm really more interested not in what I think, but in what you think,
Sure.
in terms of how you would see that as applying within the Teaching Act.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long, complicated question.
I appreciate the question. It goes very much to the core of my talk. I think there are ways in which someone can be in the classroom and express a Christian demeanor towards students, a Christ-like demeanor, even at a secular school where I'm barred from the sort of obvious trappings of prayer and Bible reading and that sort of thing in the classroom. Part of it is honoring the students by being very well prepared as a teacher. I mean, you know, if you take if you try to unpack the expression, whatsoever you do in word or in deed, do it as unto the Lord. Okay, what does that mean? Well, when it comes to preparing a lecture, for me that means the lecture should be well done. It should be thoroughly prepared. It should not be something cobbled together at the last minute. It should be a very thoughtful exercise that's worth the student's time in being there. That's what doing something as unto the Lord would mean when it comes to preparing and giving thought to the delivery of a lecture. So as a Christian, I take that very seriously, because my students are made in God's image, so I have an elevated view of who they are. They're not just a bunch of people that float in and out of my classroom. These are people made in God's image, so I've got to take them seriously. I'm under a biblical admonition, whatsoever I do in word or in deed, do it as unto the Lord. Whatsoever, for me as a teacher, that's got to include the preparation of lectures. For me, to be a steward over that time means being there for the students. So I try, after a lecture, to hang around as long as students are there and want to talk to me. That's one way of serving them. I contrast that with the way I naturally would be if I weren't a follower of Jesus. And then I think my job is to go in and give a lecture. As soon as this is over, I am out of here. Office hours, I found let me just say one other thing about the classroom. By God's grace, I have found that it's possible to teach a class of hundreds and hundreds of students and have students report on their evaluations that I care for them. Now, that has to be by God's grace, because as a matter of personal dynamics, how could that be? How could I care for hundreds of students? But what I think each student knows is that if they wanted to see me about something, they could do that. And somehow I would make the time in my schedule for them. Now, why I would do that, they may not know. But why I would do it is because they're made in God's image. The other reason I would do it is this very sobering, and I mentioned it in my talk, very sobering, almost haunting principle in Scripture that Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. That sobers and at times haunts me. I have a picture of that on my office wall. Every time I'm tempted to be short with a student, every time I'm tempted to be snippy, every time I'm tempted to act superior, all of which is my nature, I think of Jesus as a foot washer, and I think, Ken, you are called to wash this student's feet. What does that mean? You're called to be a servant of this student who, you know, has an attitude and who you don't care for and has tastes in music and lifestyle and whatever that is totally foreign to you. You are somehow called to be that servant. So you think back in Bible times, well, a servant often was called upon to serve somebody who had no connection whatsoever in terms of their lifestyle, but they were called to be a servant. And that is more so than Jesus on a cross. Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, of his students, is the image that drives very much who I am in the classroom. It also drives who I am in my office. And if I could just put a footnote on my response, I would say that what kind of seals the deal for me as a teacher in the classroom is what happens when students come to my office. And I'll make 2 points in this regard. One is, and students, you may just, in the area of full disclosure, let me just tell you that for many professors at my university, maybe it's not true at Baylor, we really don't look forward to office hours. It is seen as a necessary evil. I have a colleague who posts on his office door, office hours 8 to 9 on Friday morning. And that's a pretty clear signal that he's not eager to have a lot of students come by and see him and talk with him about economics or life in general. So I have tried to be countercultural in this regard because Jesus was so countercultural in his relations with people. To be generous in my office hours, to not be ready to close the door on a student and say, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I'm leaving, but to see that this could be one of God's divine appointments for me, somebody made in God's image to whom I am actually called in some sense that I'm still working out after 40 years, what it means to wash that student's feet. The other thing about the office is that this is a place where I am free to be very open about my faith with students. Something that is closed off in the classroom because it's not my job to teach the Christian faith. Most students at my university, if they're having trouble intellectually with economics, if they're struggling with the material, it's not because they're not smart enough to do economics. It's because they've got something else going on in their life that's keeping them from doing economics. And if you probe a little bit, you find out what that is. And oftentimes, I don't have the solution for that problem, which is really why they're not succeeding in the classroom. But as a believer, as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, when I don't have a solution to something, the Scriptures commend me to pray. And I'll ask the student, may I pray for you about that? And I don't mean some abstract way like a lot of Christians, can I pray for you about that, where the person then leaves and maybe not, you'll pray. I mean right then and there. I'll ask the student, may I pray for you about your parents' divorce? May I pray for you about this substance abuse problem you have, or whatever it is? And I have never, and I don't know if these students are believers or not, most of them are not. I have never had a student say no. Now, if you're a psych student, you're sitting there, I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking Elzinga's in this authoritative relationship with a student, he's the professor, the student, how could a student say no? You're thinking this is a student who is looking, how do you bolt out the door and get away from this religious guy? But I will tell you, I think I can read students' faces well enough to know that that is not the case. The look is more, would you be willing to pray for me? Really? I would love that. I have had Jewish students come back to my office and ask me to pray for them again because they don't know anybody to pray for them. I've had Muslim students come back and say, would you pray for me again? I have Christian students who have confessed to me that they have come into my office about economics in the hopes that I would pray for them. These are usually Asian students who really do value old guys praying for them, who respect age. But this has just been one of the breakthroughs in my office hours is being liberated to pray for students. I don't pray for every student who comes in my office. Somebody wants to know, is chapter 6 on the test? I don't say, let's pray about that. But if somebody's got a really serious problem, I pray with them about it. It's been liberating for me, and God has used that. So that's just another area where Christian faculty here certainly have as much freedom as I have to pray with students in their office, if not more so.
We
got one question up here that's been...
Okay. I am so thankful that you're here. Like the Lord actually spoke to me more last year about integrating more like holistically, and it's really encouraging for me to hear you in a secular place, higher education. And I know you've kind of already addressed the discipleship aspect of teaching, but on a practical level, I would enjoy hearing your contrast of what it looks like to disciple students in a secular environment versus here in our environment. And then secondly, how do you share your faith? Like I know you said more one-on-one in the office, but do you share your testimony at the beginning of a class? Do you share with other faculty? Do you have luncheons where you share your faith, or just kind of what does discipleship and evangelism look like in the secular context, which you know so well, and how do you compare and contrast that with what you think it should look like here?
Sure. Let me take them up in reverse order. I know a lot of professors at secular schools will, the first day of class, tell their students that they're a believer, and I have no problem with that. I don't do that. What I do the first day of class, and again, here I'll use my fall semester class with over 1,000 students, is I tell them I'm going to teach this class from a biblical perspective. And most of them have no idea what I mean by that, but I briefly, and I stress briefly, I explain that what it means to teach something from a biblical perspective is that I'm supposed to be their servant. That's what biblical leadership is all about. That's what Ken Starr is called to do as the leader of this school, is he is fundamentally, from a Christian perspective, called to be a servant. He is called to shoulder pain, not to inflict pain. And so I explain that, what biblical leadership is like. It's servanthood. I want to be their servant, and they have every right to expect that from me. And that is it. At the end of the semester, very briefly, I give a testimony, and many students know this by now, but I identify myself as a follower of Jesus. And I indicate, coming back to the very first question, that I say that, look, we studied a lot of stuff in economics, and economics has nothing to say about really big issues in life of personal identity and value. And in my case, as a follower of Jesus, I find these supernaturally revealed in the scriptures, and I move on. In terms of a public identity at the university, I have a very public identity because I regularly give talks to groups like InterVarsity and Chi Alpha and RUF, and I'm sort of a Methodist itinerant preacher in that regard of going from student group to student group, and these are publicized, and so faculty either would know this in a variety of ways, but might just see it from notices on the grounds. In terms of discipling, this took me a long time to catch on to this, and I regret that. There are a lot of things I regret about my life, and most of it is just how long it took me to catch on to doing things. So if you can start to do this at your age, that's great. I'm really dense, and things just took me 20 years to catch on to things. Discipling is a funny thing. One might think that you would disciple serious Christian students, and I tend not to do that. The guys that I disciple are, like, I'm discipling 4 guys this semester. One, I'm doing almost as a favor to his parents, who were students of mine and were solid Christians, and the boy is a solid Christian. And they are just thrilled that I would disciple their son. The other boy is a boy from China who I met his first year, and he started through me and some others attending my church, and he has just become a Christian and just wants to be baptized. He just told me a week ago he wants to be baptized. So he's a brand new baby Christian from a home with no Christian background whatsoever in China, actually quite hostile to the Christian faith, although he's working that out with his parents. But he's a baby Christian. The other 2 guys were just guys I met who I liked, and I just wrote them an email, and I said, I don't know about your spiritual background, but would you like to be discipled? So I tended to look for guys who aren't believers, really, or are kind of on the fence, and even non-Christians, so long as they don't have a chip on their shoulder against the Christian faith, they want to learn about it. And we meet. We might meet in this case, every Tuesday morning. We meet for breakfast. I have a topic. It's not a Bible study. I tend to look for people who probably wouldn't come if it were a Bible study. But we have a topic. We talk about some aspect of the Christian life. I always have a note card. I ask them what I can pray for them. They give me things to pray for. That helps me keep abreast of what's going on for a week. And then we meet the next week and we talk about what went on. It's not a touchy-feely group. I'm not that kind of guy, but they know more about my life than the typical undergraduate would know, at least about my comings and goings. And if they choose to, they can pray for me. Every now and then we might go out for a meal or go for a hike together, but it's not tremendously time absorbing. It's basically some time on Tuesday morning and then some thought about what we're going to do the following week. I pick the topics. It could be anything from Christian view of time management to dating to vocations. Last time we talked about evangelism. These two of the kids who were from Roman Catholic backgrounds and pretty much thought they had jettisoned the faith when they came to UVA. They're just, what does it even mean? Evangelism? What is that all about? And we just do it casually. It's not heavy-handed. But if I were at a school like Baylor, I would I'd want to have students like that. They might be a little more farther along in the faith than the people I attract at UVA, but I would just want to have a group of young people in my life. And frankly, it helps keep you young. I mean, you don't need that help, but I do. And it helps keep you liking young people. The greatest threat to professors is as they get older, they tend not to like young people anymore. They like the job, they just don't like young people. And but that's a real tension because you're around young people. You have to work with them. And it's a lot easier if you like them. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
We're going to have a reception, so you can hang around and ask Dr. Elzinga additional questions. Before you run away, we have a small gift. Well,
this is a small gift.
Well, it's Texas after all.
I know.
Big gifts.
Thank you. You really know you're in Texas when this is a small gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again. Let's all thank him together.